Okay. So have you been able to read any of the pages 8 to 11 that I sent you? Yeah. And so maybe we'll go around and collect some thoughts from each of you as to some, things that came up. And just for the structure of this meeting today, we'll go over what you came up with in these pages. And then I want us to focus on enslavement and different types of slavery that existed in Torah. And because this ties in with the Jubilee and with the Shemitah, okay? So just so we know what we're talking about. So, but let's first go over the things that you were, that you read. And what I'll do also is I'll try, do you all have your notebooks, like your source books? The resource books?
I have it as a PDF on my computer.
Okay, so I don't need to open it. So we're able to look at each other. Okay, good. בסדר. And you have, great. So let's begin. Maybe Ashlyn, you would like to start with things you noticed. And
the two things that I'm remembering jumped out at me. The one was that the literal translation of it is ram's horn, and I didn't realize that it coincides with Rosh Hashanah. And then the other thing
the shofar.
And then the other thing that I was thinking of was how they would go back. It was like a homecoming, and it says, think about where you would have your homecoming. So
about
that a little bit. Yeah,
I also wanted us to focus on that question. It's a powerful question, I found. Maybe we'll keep that. Let's keep that to the end, okay?
Okay.
But remind me if we don't go to it.
Okay.
The homecoming thing. So you focused on the Jubilee.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So, okay, thanks. So we have the shofar and we have the homecoming. Miranda, would you like to?
So one thing that came out to me is like, we start out talking about like the faith aspect of like how this is you're supposed to do it and reminding people how to do it. And the other thing is like, it's talking a little bit about more of like the community gathering aspect of like, even though you're supposed to do this, you're still supposed to come together as a community kind of thing throughout each of these time frames that you're celebrating this. And those are the kind of things that I kind of noticed more at the beginning. And then the Jubilee and personal freedom, I kind of skimmed over that, and that kind of stood out to me as like, hey, even though you may be celebrating this, got to keep in mind the people around you that this might be a harder time for them.
Okay, interesting. So remembering people. I'm just writing stuff down.
So I know, and then that's why I'm like re-looking at the booklet as I was talking, so that way I could kind of remember what stood out kind of to me.
And with the faith and the hakel, this act of bringing people together, I'm also kind of, what you're saying is struck me as faith. Is faith a personal thing or a communal thing, or both? Like, but maybe that could also be a question, because you put like the personal experience of people relating to these years, and then the communal aspect.
Faith can be both communal and personal. So like you have your personal way of worshiping a particular religion, and that's dictated by the wider communal religion, established religion, and then you bring it in and be like, okay, sitting down with this religion, what do these laws actually mean in practice to me? And that may be because I'm agnostic and I'm like, most likely God is an alien species that came and visited us without having a prime directive of some sort. But that gets into weird
No, fair
Speaking
enough.
nerdy
בסדר. So,
stuff.
no, but the question of personal and communal is a good question to bring up when dealing with this. Okay, so I have that down. Ilara, did you want to?
Yeah. And I just want to say I've actually been listening to way too much alien stuff lately. So I get that.
Is this like the thing? Is this like the July 2020 is aliens?
Maybe.
Well,
I mean, I think aliens are forever, but like for
well,
some
and then
people-
I grew up as a Trekkie, and then I'm a Trekkie, Battlestar Galactica, Stargate, Coyote series. Like,
Okay.
you need something science fiction with aliens. I probably have seen the movie, watched the TV show, or read the book.
Yep.
And if I haven't, it's probably going to go on my list. That's very long. This
you
one.
and me both, Miranda.
So, Ilara, do you want to
Okay,
things
yeah.
that's jumped up for you?
Yeah. So the thing that really jumped out to me, I also would like to touch on what I was thinking about the question of whether faith is communal or not. And I definitely think it's both, but I think that I think they kind of reflect each other, but I find it much harder. And I mean, I'm an extrovert and that's probably a me thing too, but I definitely find it harder to have faith in isolation of any kind, not just COVID isolation, but like I find community really important to faith, because I think that when we share our spirit with each other, it makes it brighter. It's like the candle and there was a song at one point. I don't remember.
I'm thinking of Candle in the Wind, but that might be the wrong one.
No, it was one of the Music Lover morning songs. The
Oh.
there and the something
צריך
else.
שכל איש ידע ויבין שבתוכו יש נר.
That's the
We can
one.
put that at the end. That was a very beautiful song. We can
That's a
play
good
that.
idea. I love that song.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's kind of my thought on that. I think that they really do reflect each other, but it's like a reflection and an amplification somehow. And then I really was drawn to that question of faith and release. And I really quite resonated just with that idea, because I think that they go very strongly hand in hand. I think that it's definitely harder to release if you're in a place of being fearful as opposed to being faithful, I think. And also I think it's more a relationship. It's not like a cause or effect. I think that when we release, it also nurtures our faith, because we show that we can release and that God and life is there to catch us when we do so.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was what kind of jumped out to me.
Okay, so yeah, a lot around faith, right? Oh, there's somebody that I'm not sure.
Laura probably decided that it's probably better for her to turn off her.
Yeah, no.
I'm just finishing the other half of my sandwich, but I wanted
Okay.
to be in the conversation. I'll be right. I'm still here.
Perfect. And somebody's joined us. Oh, Vivian. Hi, Vivian. How are you doing? בסדר. So, Ashlyn, would you like to say something about the shofar that you were talking about? And in relation to the Jubilee, maybe we'll expand on that just for a bit before we go into enslavement and slavery. But the shofar. Shalom, Vivian.
Shalom.
There, I'm unmuted. I don't know, I was just thinking about just that time of year and just the feelings and emotions that you're kind of feeling at that time, and that it's a time of, I don't know, there can be all kinds of feelings, I guess, but it can be the lamentation, but also almost like I guess there's some enjoyment of it. But yeah, I was just thinking of the timing, the coinciding, and I don't know like enough to know in depth about it, but it just seemed interesting to me.
So let me just read, I'm just going to open here in the book of Leviticus. It's in Leviticus, this portion, Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25, verse 8 to 10. Verse 8 to 10, yeah. Okay. And you shall count 7 Shabbatot of years, 7 years, 7 times. And the days of the 7 Shabbatot of years shall come to 49 years. And you shall send round a blasting ram's horn in the 7th month, okay, on the 10th of the month, on the Day of Atonement. You shall send round a ram's horn through all your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year and call a release in the land to all its inhabitants. So on the 49, like 7 times 7, on the 50th year, on what today we call Yom Kippur. So it's not the new year, it's actually Yom Kippur, okay? There's this blasting of the horn, and everyone's set free. All the lands go back, and all the Hebrew slaves are set free, okay? So that we'll go into slavery in a moment, but it's really important to notice that we have here on Yom Kippur, on the day when it's not, on the Day of Atonement, but it's the day of the cleansing of the temple. Okay, it's the day of the cleansing of the Mishkan. It's the day when the temple, the Mikdash, was cleaned and cleansed, and kind of everything in the world was realigned, in a sense, kind of. It's like that's the first few moments after you've cleaned your house. You know the feeling? That moment? I barely remember it. So that's the feeling. That's when we blow the shofar. And people go back to their lands every 50 years. So it's important to think of why Yom Kippur. And don't think of Yom Kippur as our Yom Kippur, okay? We've talked about Yom Kippur previously, and we're soon going to talk about Yom Kippur again. It's that time of the year, but how do we want to tie this moment of the cleansing of the Mikdash? Why at this moment? And
It's like wiping the slate clean almost in
Yeah.
a way. I just keep thinking of the emotions of it, of like hearing the ram's horn and then that the slaves would be set free. And I'm thinking of it from an emotional standpoint, I guess.
yeah, no, let's go emotional here. I mean, because there's the history and the archaeology of this, and perhaps, I mean, there are thoughts that in other cultures around Eretz Israel at the time, whenever a new king came to the throne, there would be a general release of all slaves, for instance. That was, and
I think Yom
but-
Kippur kind of gives a sense of like a big sigh of relief, kind of like,
Okay.
okay, slate has been wiped clean. I can try again for the upcoming year, kind of that sense. It might be a little bit of a different sense from the biblical historical perspective, but that kind of sense of,
And like the idea of atonement and the slaves that maybe you have to, I don't know. I know that slavery was different in those days too, that maybe they had sold themselves into bondage or whatever, but I don't know. Maybe everybody had something to atone for in that perspective too.
well, yeah, we're going to talk about it in a moment, but I don't know how. I mean, different in what sense? I mean,
Well, like I was
there are
reading
different
about
types
it
of
earlier.
slavery.
Yeah, I was reading about it earlier today that there was this article I was reading that was talking about how people had sold themselves, or it was an agreement between families that they would be a slave, but the emotions would still be the same, that you're a slave, you're not free. You're still going to have slights against you that you feel that the master would not necessarily even understand. So,
Mm-hmm. And it's still talking about inequality.
yeah.
A situation where
The
one
power.
person needs to sell themselves
Yeah.
because of debt, because of hunger, because of something.
Yeah.
It still talks about inequality. It still talks about something that's wrong with the world.
Mm-hmm.
The same with the lands, I think. the land's going back to, you know, the homecoming of the land to its original place, why would somebody sell land? What makes somebody need to sell their land? Okay, what economical situation did a person arrive at that they needed to sell their parents' land to somebody else? So again, we're staying in the emotional sphere of it here today, but I think the emotional is important. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So I want us to talk a bit about slavery. First of all, because it's really important to talk about it. It still exists in the world today, and we keep saying release of slaves and release of slaves, but that's not totally accurate. Okay? So let's see how the Torah works with it, and see how the Torah works with it. Okay, so this is in our notebook. Okay, so if you need, you can go and access it later on and check it. So I want us first to look at two types of enslavement in Torah. We have one thing that's called Eved Ivri. Okay, it's a male or a female slave from within the Hebrew nation. So I'm not going to use the word Jew because that's a bit anachronistic here, but somebody from Bnei Israel so from within your people, for instance, they needed money, so they sold themselves or they sold their daughter to somebody else as a slave. That's called Eved Ivri. And after 7 years of slavery, not a general Shemitah, counting 7 years from enslavement, they would go free, and on the Jubilee year, whichever comes first. And we'll talk about Eved Ivri in a moment. We'll look at that. The other category of slave is Eved Knaani. So that's a male or Shifcha Knaanit. So Eved is the male and Shifcha is the female for slave in Hebrew. So Eved or Shifcha Knaanim, they do not go free on the 7th year of the Jubilee. Okay, they're not freed. They are slaves forever. The way of release for them, there's a different system, and we'll look at it in a moment. So, but it's really important because when we keep talking about slaves going free, it's from within the Hebrew nation. And let's just remind ourselves also that when we talk about Shmita in the biblical sense, it's only the land of Israel that is involved in this Shmita. So there's a correlation here. Okay, it's people who are us that are in this pact of 7 years and 50 years. Okay, so this is from Leviticus here. Can you see my mouse? Can somebody please read the English here for us? I'll try making it a bit bigger. Yeah. Okay.
If your kinsman under you continues and strikes and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding. For they are my servants whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. You shall fear your God, such male and female slaves as you may have. It is from the nations around about you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of aliens resident among you, or from their families that are among you, whom they got in your land. These shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as a property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves, but as for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule ruthlessly over the other.
Okay, thank you for reading this. Okay, so we have both categories here. What's the difference?
One is from within the Israelites and are to be treated more as hired laborers, and the other is from outside of the Israelite community are allowed to be treated more like slaves and can be inherited.
Thank you. Yeah. Vivian, I thought you also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think it's the question is the idea of property, right? So who's entitled to be treated as property? And I think it's sort of related to the whole question of the land as well. It's like, is land property or is land its own thing? And I think that's what's happening here, is that the way that this text reads, it's like, you know, Israelites are not property, they're human, and then everybody else is just property.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we keep going back to the question of property.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What else do we see here?
Kind of has to go back to the idea of the land of Egypt, like our enslavement in the land of Egypt, and going back to that.
Mm-hmm.
So like, okay, why are there two categories?
Okay.
It's almost saying that Israelites can't be slaves because they belong to God and they can't belong to another man
Mm-hmm.
because they're his people.
Yeah, we're only slaves to God.
Mm-hmm.
And I started saying before, that in nations around, there was probably a custom of releasing all slaves when the new king came to power. And here in Torah, it's not tied to kingship, it's rather tied through some cycle relating to Adonai. Okay, which again puts Adonai in the place of our king, our ruler, and not a human.
It also suggests that if you're born into one tribe, your destiny is set, and if you're born into another tribe, your destiny is set. There's no agency, there's no ability to transition from one tribe to another.
Okay, interesting. That's also the land can't transition, right? The land of Israel also cannot transition.
Right, and the people can't. It's a, you know, if the families, even if they begot them in your land, so if the children were born in your land, they're still slaves, they're still property, they're not actually people.
Sorry. Yeah.
Even if they were born in your land.
Sorry, 1 second, please. Yeah, nachon. So, and that, yeah, okay. So there's like an order. The order is certain pieces of land belong to certain people. Certain people belong to certain tribes. We belong to God. Other people and lands are outside of this agreement. Okay, so within this system of Adonai and Israel, there's a sort of order that has to be kept and a sort of relationship between the people that has to be kept. Outside of that, it's a different system. There still is a system, okay? We're gonna look at the system in a moment. It's not total chaos outside, but it's a different system, which I don't agree with, but it's still there. So we first need to look at it, can understand what it says in Torah, and then see what we do about this. But
it makes me curious about tribal gods, like rival gods, because we're talking about the relationship between the Israelites and God, and then other people are outside of that, but they had gods too. So it makes me wonder, it really makes me curious about like what the religious connotations of that being outside was, like what that relationship was. Like, yeah, that's what just came into my mind, being curious about that.
interesting. And were they under the protection of their God?
Yeah.
when they were on Israelite land.
Hmm. And I think it really varied. Like some, as far as I understand, some gods were very much local gods, like they were attached to a place, and then it was like revolutionary when God went with the tribe of Israel, because God came with you, like, which was different than having a God that was attached to a specific land instead of a specific people.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think, like when you're putting it that way, it's like God is and isn't connected to the land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because so this whole category of mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz that we talked about, commandments that are tied to the land,
Yeah.
or connected to the land, could be a sort of layer of this is where God is. This is where holiness is. This is where it's sacred. And then we have this kind of dialogue between a God that can move around with the people
Mm-hmm.
and be in no man's lands like deserts and is the ruler of the world and creator of the world. But on the other hand, when we unpack this story of Shemitah, this on the biblical level, on the Torah level, Adonai is very much connected to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And the people are very much connected to the land. So it doesn't see, I mean, because if Adonai was, the Adonai that's talking about Shemitah was truly universal, then the whole of the land of the world should have gone back, should have had Shemitah.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe this is a kind of a remnant of the God of the land aspect of Adonai.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the people that belong to him and are under his rule are within this. And people who do not belong to him, they don't enjoy this. They can't enjoy this. But what happens with the slaves with Evet Kanani? So there's a few. So first of all, in Exodus, we have he or Makeish Vamet Mot Yumat. So he who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death, okay? In general, generally speaking. Okay. But then, continuing there, it says, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, not Hebrew slave, with a rod, and he dies there and then, or she dies there and then, he must be avenged. But if he survives there too, he is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property. So we're talking here about a Canaanite slave, because we have the word property here. So what's the rule relating to a slave? Are you allowed to kill your slave?
No.
No. What are you allowed to do in this instance, this piece of Torah? Vivian, you're on mute.
You're allowed to beat him, but not to kill him.
You're allowed to beat them, but not to kill them. I know. Okay, I just have to say this whole thing is a bit triggering for me. This whole section on slavery is just, I was, when I was putting this piece together, I was just like, very difficult, but we're gonna work through it. The good news is that even when, even rabbinic commentary on this and medieval commentary is uncomfortable with this, okay? So, but yes, you're allowed to beat your slave, male or female, as long as you don't kill them. Rashi, the medieval commentator, he sees this word bashevet with a rod, and he says, oh, so if you're beating them with a rod, which might mean that you're not actually intending to kill them, then if they survive the beating, it's okay. But you're not allowed to beat them with a sword or something, okay? Right. So if you were intending to kill them, then you are, then it's a death penalty for you. So I think, which, more than even what it says in Torah, it says more about the commentary that's already uncomfortable with this piece of Torah here. because this is really not treating a human like a human.
So what is that stipulation about if he survives a day or two about?
So what is it about?
That's what I'm trying to figure out, because you've still killed him or her or them.
Mhm.
So I'm not quite understanding the distinction. Like, why does time
Well, I
change
think
the
it has to
distinction?
do with like more of like when to implement the revenge class, the avengement aspect of like, hey, they survived the beating, which means it's not enough to kill them outright. Kind of trying to make that line, but again, it's still like, even if it has a day or two, that's still, you still killed them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. נכון. So this is not for, this doesn't sit well with our sense of justice.
No.
For any of us. They did try to make some distinction between, I think they, if I'm looking at it, I'm saying maybe they're trying to distinguish between the severity of the beating and basically that's what I can make of it. How hard did you actually beat them? And but you're still not allowed to kill them outright. Which, when I'm looking at some commentary says, some, contemporary commentary says, oh, in other places in that area, people were allowed to do whatever they wanted to their slaves. So this is supposedly an improvement. That always brings the question to my mind, well, it might be an improvement, but, this is Torah. Can it not be just much improved? Could they not just have added, like, you're not allowed to kill your slave? So that always sits there. But yeah, you're not allowed outright to kill your slave. Another thing that, and it's here, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. So again, this is a Knani, Evet Knani, which is a title for any slave who isn't Hebrew. So one way, sorry,
Okay,
yeah.
I'm wondering if that is a permanent freedom or like workers' compensation.
This is, from what I understood, from what I looked at, this is freedom. They can't be slaves anymore.
Interesting.
Or, they can't be his
Well, then
slaves.
workers' compensation kind of sucks comparatively.
So workers' compensation means you go out, you get
You,
some time
like,
off.
Yeah, you get like a couple months off to heal and then you're back at the grind.
What I understood, looking at this and reading commentary, is that is a way for a Canaanite slave to go free. So again, if you want this slave to remain your slave, be careful.
Yeah.
Like, don't kill them and don't maim them.
Right.
Because if you maim them, they're not slaves anymore.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it feels like they're trying to bracket the range of acceptable behavior.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good way of saying it.
Maybe not a bracket that we would like, but it does appear that it's a bracket that they had in mind.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's what they were trying to do. Because even within a situation of slavery, you can't totally lose your senses and decide that people are not human anymore.
Right.
That Deuteronomy piece is interesting.
Yes, this is very interesting. And it was like my one happy place here, but it was great. So, Laura, do you want to read it?
Sure. You shall not turn over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from their master. He shall live with you in any place you may choose among the settlements in your midst, wherever he please. You must not ill-treat him.
Interesting.
Very.
This is very interesting because again, apparently, according like the Hammurabi laws, from what I saw, if a person hides a runaway slave, that person dies. If a person helps a slave run away, that person dies. So here we have something very different.
Huh.
Okay, so a slave can run away and you're not allowed to return the slave to the master. Again, because I think what they thought was if somebody gets to the stage where they're running away, they're probably being mistreated.
Yep.
And then they can live with you wherever they choose. Okay, so this is interesting. This is interesting. So we have the Eved Ivri, which is basically a bound labor for a set period of time of 7 years. And it's different for male and female in the Eved Ivri situation, okay? If, with women, it's a bit different, and men, it's a bit different. Fathers could sell their daughters into slavery. Fathers could not sell their sons into slavery with the Eved Ivri situation. There's all sorts of sexual rules and marriage rules around the girl Hebrew slave, okay? With the Eved Knani, it's the same situation for men or women. And there are more laws. I just picked a few of the laws relating to slavery. But I just wanted us to see the difference and to notice when we're talking of traditional Shemitah that we're not talking about all slaves. That's something to think about. So before we go into the homecoming, just to kind of close this little snippet about slavery, is that in the same way that we said that Shemitah related to the land of Israel and the people of Israel, and today we're talking about Shemitah relating to the whole world and to all of humanity. So I think this expansion is trying to cover everything. Okay, how do we set all of humanity free? What does that mean, to set all of humanity free? All animals free, okay?
When we're talking about slavery right now, we're defining it as like of the Israelite tribe or not of the Israelite tribe, but what is it that actually defines the slavery? Like, they're not to be ill-treated because it will be avenged, but what is that power dynamic? I'm just curious because I'm like, there's so many levels of it, and I'm just curious about how it applies in contemporary times, because we definitely have like unpaid slaves. That's a very real thing still, but we also have like bottom of the line under minimum wage workers who can't put food on the table. Like, so there's like, I'm just wondering about what actually defines that.
And then we got the prison complex issue in the US where
Oh, there's so many layers of it, but I'm just wondering about if there's like a definition in Torah of like what that relationship actually is, like other than just saying slave and master.
Yeah, so there's one interesting thing here, Lo tirdebo b'farech. Okay, and it was translated here, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but of parech or avodat parech, which is what we were told the Israelites were doing in Egypt, has been understood in Jewish tradition as work that is useless or that has no meaning to it. And I can think of many people in our society today who are bound to meaningless, soul-sucking jobs.
Yep.
Okay, so that's avodat parech.
Okay.
There's a lot written about it today, and because the question keeps going back to what defines your humanity. And for instance, with a Hebrew slave, a slave that decides that he, going to speak of a man now, okay, specifically a man, he wants to stay with his master, gets his ear pierced to the door. You remember that bit? When goes to the door and his ear is pierced. And that's a sign of shame, that a person has chosen to remain a slave. Even though he loves his master and maybe he has a wife and children there. And like we can, again, there's one emotional aspect of it that we like, but the other emotional, spiritual aspect of it is you cannot allow yourself to fall in love with a situation of slavery, which I think we can all look at ourselves and ask ourselves. So I think it's a very wide range of human behavior and human relationships, from the very, real slavery of children being kidnapped from their homes nowadays, to work in terrible, cocoa fields, or, people who are digging up the batteries for these things that we have, and all that kind of stuff, which is, mamash slavery. To first world slavery, which is still could be defined by Torah as slavery. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for
somewhat?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. I just think it's a very wide range, and that's so sad.
Yeah.
But we have such a wide range of behaviors and relationships that could fall under definitions of slavery today. Like, it means that something's really problematic in our society.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think that it's very common to name it something else and then kind of turn a blind eye and say specific it's not slavery, but it's like they're working a job that is meaningless and they're depressed and they have no money. Like, that's slavery. Like, yeah. So yeah, no, I it is sad that it's such a wide range, but I think it's also sad that we don't acknowledge it very often.
Yeah. So I think this is part of the practice of noticing it. That's why I think Shmita is really, it's an extremely important mitzvah, I think. And it is because it brings up to the surface all these questions of our relationships in a very clear way. So let's say something about the homecoming, so we don't end this year now with being depressed about slavery. And we should be depressed about slavery, but let's not end on that note. Let's keep the...
and on a high note.
Let's try and end with a high note. So, and Ashlyn here reminded us on page 10, if you want to look at the bottom of page 10, is there one place that you might consider your own true home? The place you would hope to which you and your children would always be able to return? So that was a beautiful question. Do we have answers?
Well, for me personally, it would be the northeast of the U.S. because that's where most of my mom's side of the family and my dad's family is.
And what do you think about when you think about it as home? Like, is there any
family gatherings? So many cousins that I don't even remember half their names, especially my mom's father's side of the family. And then seeing all the cousins that I remember being born and being knee-high to a grasshopper, being taller than me, and in their 20s.
Yeah.
That's kind of a scary thing for me to think of. Like, I actually have seen most of my cousins on that side of the family grow up.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else like to share what home means?
I guess to me it's kind of...
Oh, Vivian, we can't hear you for some reason.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, I guess it works kind of at a bunch of different levels, the idea of home. Because on the one hand, home is here in Edmonton where we are. That's sort of the obvious level. And then on another level, I guess we were always taught, I guess my parents taught us that home is wherever you find yourself, and that you know, we're wanderers and we are the wandering Jews. So wherever we are is where home is, and we
Mm-hmm.
have a portable worldview, a portable understanding of the world, so that it isn't tied to a place. It's more tied to people and family and connection. So I think there's that level of just knowing that, you know, we've often said, I think as a family, we've often said, look, you know, if we had to move to China tomorrow because that's what the world provided, we would pick up and go.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we don't speak the language and we don't know the culture and we don't know the people, but we would figure it out like our parents did before us and our grandparents did before them, because that's what you do as a Jew, is you just kind of go and sort it out. And then I guess at another level, there is a sort of a connection to Israel and a connection to the idea that there is this Jewish homeland that, you know, is a touch point, even though we've never lived there or we've never grown up there, but just that sort of metaphysical idea of a safe space that can be a place to go if there's no place else to go, or it could be just a place to go just for fun, go visit. So I think at a level, that's also a kind of sense of home, without it being, say, really a physical home. I mean, we've been to visit, but we've never lived there, right? But there's just a sense of connection.
Thank you.
I think for me, I'm kind of in my mind trying to differentiate a little bit the difference between a sense of home and a sense of place. And like, or like maybe home and homeland or home and place, because I really resonate with what you said, Vivian. Like, I have moved around a lot and I've lived in many places, and I've always felt really blessed to feel at home wherever I am. And I love that. Like, I love meeting new people, and I love connecting with new places, and I love building community in many places. That's something that I really deeply cherish in life. And then there's also, like, there's the land of my ancestors where I've never been in Ukraine. And then there's also Nova Scotia, which is where, like, my dad's side of the family all lives and my dad grew up. And I think that Nova Scotia is the place that I've felt the most connected to, even though I only lived there for like 2 or 3 years in my young adulthood. I grew up with stories of that place. So when I went there, it was like living the stories, right? So that was a different kind of a connection to feeling at home.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, it was like a connection with the place in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I feel like there's a little bit of a differentiation. My mom and I were actually talking about it after Shabbat the other day, because of the conversation that came up around diaspora. She's actually reading a book on Ukrainian homeland and diaspora right now, so there was a lot of interplay there. So yeah, I think those are my thoughts, but I really do connect with the idea of feeling at home everywhere I am. That's something I love about life.
Thank you. Ashlyn, thank you, Laura. Ashlyn?
I guess when I was thinking about it originally, now you guys had all these great ideas. I was thinking about times that I've felt more at home, and I thought about the lake house when we were kids and growing up there, and the smells of my grandma's house when we would walk in, and her cooking and all the things that it's like a feeling, that feeling of home. And really it's wherever your family, to me, it's wherever my family is. It could be anywhere, but I hadn't really thought of an actual physical place until you guys were mentioning that. And I started thinking about when I went to Ireland, and that's where my family's from. And I felt like it was a homecoming, even though I'd never been there before. And it was like my cellular, like my DNA knew it was home. So it's, I don't know, it's interesting to think about it that way too.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how the body feels stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of where I feel at home. And well, yeah, I mean, it's always, so Israel, of course, because my family's there and that's my land. I think also feeling at home in the language. So Hebrew, and now that we're here for a few years and my children have stopped speaking Hebrew to us. They still understand because we speak Hebrew to them, but they're not answering in Hebrew is very disorientating for me. Like it's a very strange feeling. And it takes a bit of the home out of home, in a sense, because they're not answering in the language they should be answering me in. So that's, but it's interesting about the DNA. I had like the weirdest experience 20 years ago. I was traveling with a friend, an English friend of mine, and we're traveling in Germany. And we're kind of on the train going around Germany. And then I remember going into Berlin, and it was the weirdest feeling of just feeling at home. Like I'd never been there before. And maybe it was because the food reminded me of my grandma's food. She came from Bukovina, which is a German influenced part of Romania. And the sound of the German, she would speak German to her sisters. So I think maybe that, it just like really felt like I recognized things, like the food, the atmosphere was very, I can much remember the feeling, and it was very surprising for me. And I'm thinking about like these connections that are so intricate. What means home, what home means. But yeah, family, I think where family is, I definitely.
So where in the Bukovina was your grandmother from?
She was from Černovic.
Černovic, yeah.
I mean, in a village next to Černovic, and then yeah.
Yeah, that's where my family's from too, from Černovic.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, my parents were both born there actually.
In Černovic.
Černovic.
Yeah, she loved that city. Like she.
Yeah, my parents did too. There were a lot of fond stories about Černovic in our family.
Okay. So, okay. So this is nicer than talking about slavery. Lovely memories for everyone. Okay, I'll just stop the recording here now.